Hello, people on the internet. Yes, I did get this short shirt at the thrift store. It's okay. It's okay to be whoever you are. All right. I can't even talk today. Organismal Development Part 2. Turn to 256. This lesson is going to be extremely confusing. So brace yourself. It's going to be a bumpy ride. At the bottom of page 256, your book kind of gives you an outline of some basic life cycles from animals, plants, and fungi. I'm going to tell you right now, plants are kind of confusing because depending on what type of plant it is, there's two different mechanisms in place. Animals, y'all are pretty familiar with. You have, if you're looking at an animal, like let's say you look at someone in your family or anybody that's around you, the cells that you're looking at, unless you got some kind of good x-ray vision, are what type of cells? Haploid or diploid? Diploid cells. So they have two sets of chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad. And then in order to make offspring, they divide that number down through the process of meiosis and make sperm and egg, and then the sperm and egg come together to form a new diploid cell, a zygote, like we saw in our Miracle of Life video yesterday, and then the new organism grows from there. Well, fungi are pretty much the opposite. If you see a fungi, like if you were looking at the mycelium, the hyphae that grow out of the fungi, you would be looking at a haploid organism. Those cells would be haploid in nature. And they have to go through the combining of those cells. They have to undergo meiosis and then basically start dividing in order to occupy or colonize different areas. So it's very different because the main body of the organism is haploid in nature, whereas we're used to seeing things that are diploid. Most trees that you see, flowering plants that you see outside, those are similar to us. So that's a little bit easier. But a lot of older, less evolved plants, like mosses and ferns and things of that nature, they're very different from like trees or flowering plants that you see. So that's why the lesson is going to be a little bit confusing. So just try to follow along and get the important concepts as we go through and discuss them. Number one, Walker.
Haploid refers to having one half the DNA content of a normal diploid cell. We represent it as N.
So when you're talking about N, I like to think of that N number. So our N number was what?
2.
What?
Or no. We
What?
have 2 N cells, but
Well, all it,
64, right? No.
you got 64 chromosomes?
No.
How many chromosomes do we have? 46, and what type of cells? Okay, so in your sperm and egg, you have how many? 23. So our N number is 23. There are, so what that basically means is there are 23 different chromosomes that have different genes coding for stuff on them. And then you have 2 sets of each one of those. You get one of those from mom and one of those from dad. So you get like 2 chromosome 1s. And chromosome 1s code for certain genes. Now, but there may be different versions of those genes on there depending on what your parents inherited. You know, like we talked about skin color a second ago. But it's still coding for like skin color. So we've got 23 different chromosomes coding for different stuff, okay? And just when the sperm and egg come together, you get a pair of each one of those. Diploid cells or diploid, however you want to say it. Di or bi means? 2. So diploid or diploid cell, I don't care, refers to having 2 halves of a whole. Normal DNA content is represented as 2N. So in our case, that would be 46 chromosomes. You get 23 from mom, 23 from dad. It varies from organism to organism. Horses are like, I want to say they have 60 or 62, somewhere in there. Chimps, I think, have 48. Fruit flies have 8. Is there 2N? So it really, and then some things have like a really large set of chromosomes. I want to say like hermit crabs or some kind of crabs up like in the 130 or something. Anyway, y'all can look it up. But anyway, some have a lot, some have little. Doesn't necessarily make you smarter or less smart to have more or less. Now, you need to maintain that chromosomal number. We'll get into genetics and we'll talk about chromosomal abnormalities like Down syndrome. So when you have less or you have more because of some uneven splitting that took place during meiosis, that can cause issues. Now, some organisms are polyploidy, meaning they have a bunch of them. We have not done DNA extraction yet, I don't think, did we? We extracted DNA from like strawberries. I think I still got strawberries in the freezer, and we can use those. And we may actually do that before the break or right when we get back. But strawberries, I want to say have eight in, so 8 sets. Because, well, I'm not gonna get into it right now. But anyway, they can deal with more sets, and actually, sometimes it's beneficial to plants to have extra sets. I want to say like seedless watermelon. They usually do that by crossing a diploid watermelon with a like a 2N watermelon with a 4N watermelon, and the seedless watermelon is 3N, and so that's why it doesn't produce the seeds. And so there's some complicated stuff that goes on there. But anyway, let's see. S phase replicates DNA of the cell. Mitosis has 1 division of DNA. Meiosis has 2. Remember, it has to split twice because you have to reduce the chromosomal number. We're going to get into the details of that during Mendelian genetics in the latter part of January. So all you really need to know right now is meiosis produces sperm and egg. Okay. Here's a good question, Mason. How do you define what sperm and egg are? Like if you're talking about a pine tree or humans or a frog or whatever, and you've got these reproductive cells, they both have half the chromosomal number. How do you determine which one is sperm and egg? What are the characteristics?
One fertilizes and the other like goes to another.
One goes inside the other? Okay, that's one good. Yeah. What else? Katie, what are some characteristics of sperm and egg that help us define them?
Well, that's really what I was thinking. That like one has to like get in or whatever the other. But I mean, if they're not humans, I don't know.
Hey?
I was gonna say like the type of DNA that they carry, like each.
Not necessarily. I mean, like you're thinking more of like mammals where you have, or like mammals primarily where you have X and Y chromosomes. But still, even like a sperm could have an X chromosome or it could have a Y chromosome. Now, you know the egg's gonna have an X in humans or in other mammals, but for sperm it could be either or. So that's not really. And then like other animals, a lot don't have sex chromosomes like we do. They're maybe temperature dependent, like a lot of turtles and reptiles and stuff. What defines sperm and egg? Sarah? Your lack of eye contact. Let me know that I didn't want me to call on you. Mariah, did you get a haircut? Looks good. We're going to call you Big Haircut from now on. What's the difference between sperm and egg?
The egg is what
That-
forms into what's like in plants, or
Anything.
the sperm is what fertilizes.
Mason already said that. All right, the egg is generally bigger, contains more material for the developing organism. The sperm is usually smaller, and it's the one that's motile, meaning it's the one that's moving toward the egg. So if you think about like pollen from a pine tree or an oak tree in the springtime, when you're getting all that yellow stuff on your car. What's all that yellow stuff? Pollen, good. And pollen is basically what? Yeah, it's like plant sperm. It is technically a spore. It's haploid in nature. And that spore or pollen is moving toward the egg or ovule on the plant. So, for instance, like pine trees, they have female cones. That's the big ones, like the one over there above Nathan. And inside those little pieces of the cone, you know, the little spiky parts, inside down in there, there's a ovule or an egg residing in there. And so it's relying on wind to transport that pollen grain in there to fertilize that egg, and then for it to develop into a seed, which will then develop and then spread out from the main plant. So yes, sperm's usually smaller. It's the one that's motile. It's the one that's fertilizing the egg. The egg is usually larger. It's stationary. It's staying in one location. Now, some things like a lot of fish or frogs, like the males and the females will both throw out sperm and egg. But usually what's happening is the male is releasing sperm around where the eggs are so that they can find and then fertilize those eggs. So that's the key difference between sperm and egg. All right, fungal life cycles. Now, on the left side of 256 here, excuse me, the right side, you can see fungi. That doesn't really tell us anything. Let's go over to 251, or 252, sorry. I mean, 652. 652. All right, on 652. This is a very generalized life cycle among fungi. There's 4 or 5 different main phyla of fungi. There's one called imperfect fungi that they have never even observed a sexual life cycle in. I think that penicillium is one of the groups of those. So they don't even, either they haven't seen it or it's devolved a life cycle of sexual reproduction, which seems odd because you'd never have any, variation thereafter. So I don't know about that one. Let's see here. Majority of life cycle is spent as a haploid asexual organism. So most fungi are spending their life in haploid. So if you look at fungal cells, they're going to be haploid in nature. They're going to be in. They are asexual, meaning they're reproducing asexually. Number 1, Miranda.
This allows the organism to reproduce much faster and colonize a dead organism for food and reduce competition with other organisms.
So if you're reproducing asexually, like we said yesterday, the benefit is you can reproduce very, very quickly, and you can colonize an area much faster than the competition if it's trying to asexually or sexually reproduce. So that is the benefit. And a lot of them do that, and fungi do really well. I mean, and so number 2, haploid spores. Matthew?
Haploid spores can be produced by mitosis and then released to reproduce in favorable environments and very quickly.
So, how many of y'all have ever stepped on a puffball outside? No one in first period had done this. You know the little round, they're not mushrooms, they're little round fungi that's on the ground, and then you step on them and like a little cloud of dust comes out? Gosh, y'all need to get out more. You kick them?
Oh, yeah.
Nathan knows what I'm talking about. So the stuff that looks like smoke that comes out of there is what?
Spores.
Those are the spores. Those are haploid spores that are released. They're going to spread all over the place through the wind and air. They're going to settle somewhere else, and then they're going to start to grow. Most of the fungi is where? Like the body of the fungi. Underground. So you're not going to see it. The hyphae and the mycelium, the main body extensions of the fungi that's growing is underground. Good. When you see like a mushroom or a puffball or something like that, Katie, what are you observing? What part of the fungus is that?
Like the sexual part?
Yes, it is the fruiting body. It is the part for sexual reproduction. Very good. And so that's usually what we just see, but the main part of the fungus is underground from there. Sometimes you see these things called fairy rings in your yard, or maybe in somebody else's yard. You drive by, you see a bunch of mushrooms in like a big circle in the yard. You ever seen that? That's typically, so like wherever that circle forms, that entire area inside that would probably be occupied by the same fungi. And then it's creating that fairy ring, those mushrooms around it, to help fertilize and then spread out from there. The second part, number 2. Read that for us, Mason.
Fungi use the diploid state to create variation.
Remember, variation helps with survival in a changing environment.
Okay, so if a fungi is in a changing or harsh environment and it needs to create variation, it's going to undergo sexual reproduction. So how does it go about doing that? You need to know these three phases, and they're pretty simple here. The first phase, Katie, is called plasmogamy. Tell us about that.
This is the fusion of cytoplasms. Positive is male, negative is female. The female is signaled by the release of pheromones from the male.
Keep going.
The fusion together of hyphae results in a heterocharon, means different nuclei, or dikaryotic means two nuclei.
So basically, the first part here, plasmogamy. Plasma is referencing what?
The plasma membrane.
Plasma membrane. So you have, if you flip back to 250 at the top of the page there, the structure of a fungi is made of these little extensions called hyphae. And so you have these little different cells, and then inside them you have nuclei. Some of them are multinucleate, but we're not going to worry about that right now because that would only confuse all of us. And so basically what happens is those little different cells in the hyphae, they're going to fuse together in one cell. So once they fuse together, now how many nuclei do you have? If they're each haploid and they've got a nuclei, I mean, it doesn't matter if they're really haploid or diploid, but you've got two different nuclei, then they're going to fuse together. How many nuclei do you have? Two. So you got two nuclei in there inside this one cytoplasm now. And then karyogamy happens, Nathan?
This is the fusion of the nuclei. This makes the hyphae now two in diploid in genetic context.
Okay, so you have these two haploid sets of DNA. The cytoplasms fuse together, so you still had them, but they were just kind of hanging out together in the cytoplasm. And then those two nuclei fuse together in this process called karyogamy. Kary, the K-A-R-Y, think of like prokaryote, eukaryote. That kary means what? Nucleus. Like prokaryote meant before nucleus. So anytime you see that, that's what that means, okay? And so the cytoplasm's fused, then the DNA fused, so now you have a cell that is diploid in nature. Fungi, their actual cells, they want to be what, though? Haploid. So you got to get back to that haploid state. How do you go back to an haploid state? While creating genetic variation. Meiosis. Good. Anytime you undergo meiosis, like we undergo meiosis to create sperm and eggs, right? So they're undergoing meiosis. They're splitting. They're separating chromosomes. They're crossing over. We'll talk more about how genetic variation is made when we get to genetics, but they're doing that process in meiosis there. And they're getting back to that haploid state. And now you have cells that are what?
They're different.
Different than the original cells. Good.
Because they integrated the,
DNA from two different ones.
Okay.
And then these different cells are then going to do what to spread?
They're going to
Undergo. How do cells divide and make more copies? Mitosis. So these cells are going to start undergoing mitosis and divide, and then they'll spread that way. Okay. We'll actually, I think when we do, there's a meiosis lab in January. When we do that lab, we will actually use fungal spores. I've got some pictures and stuff about spores that have just underwent meiosis and then mitotic division, and we'll use that to calculate a bunch of stuff, basically how like crossing over takes place and how that differentiation takes place. But we'll come back to this again. But basically, this is the process in order to get that more genetic variation in fungi. Okay? All right, plants. Turn over to 634. All right, I'm going to say this, and actually turn to 631. That looks better. Plants are confusing when it comes to sex because, so I'm going to just call them like lower order plants, things like, and I'm just going to talk about fungi, or excuse me, not fungi, ferns and mosses. Those are ones y'all are probably familiar with. Mosses are kind of the simplest of the plants, if you will. Ferns are still pretty simple. These are plants that do not have what? Mosses and ferns do not have seeds, okay? Now, when you go to seed plants like gymnosperms and angiosperms, gymnosperms are things like conifers, and angiosperms are all the flowering plants. Okay? These things have seeds. Okay? So there's a big distinction there. Spores and seeds, there's a huge difference between the two. Okay? So let's go through this. Sexual reproduction in plants is referred to as alternation of generations. All that means is you're going back and forth between a haploid and a diploid state. Similar to what you see in other organisms, so don't let that confuse you too much. All right. So the sporophyte. Now, a couple things to note here. Anytime you see that PHYTE, phyte, that's referencing what? Anyone? Sporophyte, bryophyte, gametophyte, coniferophyta. That's referencing plants. So anytime you see that part of the word or anywhere in a word, it's probably referencing something to do with a plant. Gametophyte, you can probably figure out what that's referencing there. All right, so sporophyte. This generation produces diploid spores that undergo meiosis to become haploid spores. So the sporophyte, you can see in the picture here on 631. For mosses, it's the little things that come up out of the top. Those are the sporophytes. Those are diploid in nature. They're going to produce spores eventually. The sporophytes in the ferns are the main body of a fern that you would see. Okay? In trees and other flowering plants like gymnosperms and angiosperms, the sporophyte is the main plant body. Okay? So like you see a pine tree, like us, it's diploid cells. And then some of those cells are going to develop into spores, sperm and egg, or pollen and ovule. Okay? So, haploid spore, number one under that. Read that for. I'm tired of talking. Gosh, Miranda, read that for us.
The haploid spores are released in the case of seedless plants into the environment or retained in the case of gymnosperms or angiosperms, the seed-producing plants.
Yeah, if you see angiosperm, all that means is flowering plants. So, what's the difference between one thing that's important here, really important. What's the difference between a seed and a spore? My hair's getting crazy, y'all. Put this out here on the internet. Yes. Matthew, are you going to answer the question or not? About jumped out of his seat. Did you see him? You turn this. Where's Ashlyn? Has anybody seen her? Can't talk about that on the internet. Be quiet. Seeds are what? Seeds are made of? God bless America. We got a lot to learn here. Okay, let's keep going here and then we'll come back to that question. Released spores hopefully will find a suitable environment and grow and produce a gametophyte. Retained spores, like in the case of seed-bearing plants, will develop into a new single-cell gametophyte, the sperm or egg. Okay? So what that means here on 631 is plants like mosses and ferns, they're going to release spores into the environment and they're going to grow into this little gametophyte. That gametophyte is then going to produce either sperm or egg. And then the sperm or egg will come together and form the sporophyte. Okay? In seed-bearing plants, think of like a pine tree. A pine tree has little cones like the ones you see on, you see the ones that are like yellow and kind of skinny there in the middle? Those are the male cones. Those are going to produce pollen, aka the pine sperm, okay? The female cones at the top there, I'm kind of simplifying this as best I can for you guys. The bigger cones that you normally see, like the one in the case up there, those are the female cones which contain the ovule or eggs inside them. Okay, so those spores, the pollen is released. It's going to find the other spore, the egg, and it's going to come together and form this new sporophyte or new plant. I've got some pine seeds over there. I'll show you in a minute. But anyway, and that's very similar to like how humans reproduce, right? You got a diploid organism, produces sperm, produces egg, it produces these haploid cells. They come back together, they form another diploid organism. Okay, that's pretty much how these seed-bearing plants work. So a seed, let's look at it here. Like I said, I'm trying to get too in depth with this, and I don't want to look at flowers because they're even more complicated. Turn to 634. On 634, the pine seed. All right, so once that fertilization takes place and that pine seed over there on the bottom left forms, that seed is going to be released from the pine cone. Y'all can see how that's the inside of the pine cone there on the bottom left. You know, the spiky part that can kind of get you if you grab a hold of it. Those seeds are released and they fall out or fly out. They actually spin around like a helicopter. Hold on, I'll see if I got some. They look very similar to a maple seed. If you've ever seen a maple seed that flies, pine seeds are about the same. Oh, I think these are all curled up, but maybe they'll still fly. That's lost a seed. Kept these in better shape. But they're similar. Ah. And here we go. So, for the sake of the internet, this is a female cone. Inside these little things right here, that's where the seed would develop. And then once they mature, which you see on the bottom left of 634, then they fall out. Okay, that didn't work. Let's see if we do this. No. Look like somebody important?
I don't think so.
Look, y'all see it?
Yep.
What you people on the internet, see if y'all can pause this.
Yeah.
And so it's got like this aerodynamic nature to it so that it spreads out away from the tree. What the heck? Come on, ding dong, ditch me here. Alright, so seeds can develop into a new plant. Their chromosomal number is what? Are they diploid or haploid?
Haploid.
Seeds. Diploid. So if you look there on the bottom left at 634, they are diploid. Spores, flip over to page 6. We gotta back this thing up a little bit here. 624. Okay, we've got a fern. I don't know if you've ever seen a fern out in the wild, but underneath the leaves, a lot of times you'll see these little brown dots. That's where the spores develop. Spores are then released. Okay? So what's the difference between a spore and a seed?
Spores are haploid and seeds are diploid.
Yeah, so seeds are diploid. They've got more nutritive tissue to grow into a new plant. Spores are haploid. They're very small and little, and they'll grow into this new gametophyte. Now, you'll notice here with the fern, or the same way with the moss, you're going to have a little, you're going to have a female gametophyte that grows up and produces. Female produces. Gametophyte produces. What? Female produces eggs. Good. And then the male gametophyte produces sperm. Now, like in the case of mosses and ferns, what do they need in order to fertilize? If you think about like oak trees and pine trees and other flowering plants, what's their two modes of fertilization? How do they get fertilized, sperm and egg? How do they get together?
Bees.
Okay, so pollinators is one method, like bees and birds and bats and stuff like that, where one of them carries the pollen from one plant to another flower on another plant, right? The other mode of pollination is wind. So in the spring, when you have gigantic amounts of yellow stuff all over your car, that's pollen trying to make its way to the female gametophyte somewhere like on a pine cone or on an oak tree and try to make it from one oak tree to a flower on another one. For mosses and ferns, they do not use those methods. How do they get sperm to egg? You need to look at the picture and think about where you find mosses and ferns. Water. They need a thin film of water in order for fertilization to take place. That's why you always find mosses and ferns and these other seedless plants in moist areas, because that is the only way that fertilization can take place for them, for those spores to spread and these new gametophytes to form and then the sperm to get to the egg. Okay, so it's a much different adaptation, and it's consequently also why you don't see many of those plants, because if you need water to get somewhere, you're never going to be found where? If you need water for reproduction, you're never going to be found where?
In dry.
Where it's dry, like on a ridge top or on a dry field or something like that. You're never going to be there. You're always going to be close to water, like in a low spot. That's the only place you're going to be able to grow and develop. Okay? So, any questions on that? That's kind of the main gist of what you need to know there. And then once those sperm and egg come together, it forms the new sporophyte, and then it goes through the process again. But a big thing is knowing the difference between sperm and egg and what's going on. I told you plants are a little bit complicated. Now, I prefer growing plants through vegetative reproduction or propagation. This is where you take a plant, a piece of a plant, and you grow a new plant from it. So last year we tried this in class. I brought some cuttings where I'd pruned some fig trees at my house, and I brought them to school. And students, we cut the bottom of the cutting off, the bark off of there, and we scraped it up with a knife. And we dipped that cutting in some rooting hormone, and then we stuck it in some potting soil and stuck it back there in the back. And spring break and COVID happened. So now I've got about 20-something fig trees at home that are growing in pots out under my pecan tree that I will plant this winter, and they should grow into new fig trees on my property. So I'm wanting to, at the either end of this year or first of next year, we go through and we propagate and grow. You guys can grow your own fig trees. So I'll bring some cuttings from home. We'll do that process, and we will grow some new trees from just a stick off of the fig tree. It's pretty easy to do. Most of them usually work pretty well. So these different methods of propagation here, fragmentation, cutting, that's where you take a piece of the plant and you grow a new plant from it. Grafting is where you take a piece of a plant and you graft it or put it onto another plant. Almost all fruit trees are grown through grafting one plant onto another. I'm gonna take y'all outside in a minute and I'll show you this. And so it's just it's a quicker, easier, more effective method than growing stuff from seeds. Okay, much quicker. Let's see, apoptosis, last thing here we need to get through. In the video yesterday, we witnessed apoptosis occurs in a few things in the human body during the developmental process. What are they? What is apoptosis? Programmed cell death. Where does it happen?
Like fingers and toes.
Fingers and toes. So started out with a little web, fingers and hand and foot, and then the cells in between die to form what is our fingers and toes. What else died off that was there early on? Tail. So the tail that we all start off with, those cells die off, and hopefully you no longer have a tail. If you do, wiggle it and have fun. So whatever. But most of us don't, except for my aunt who had to get that 3 inches chopped off her tailbone. So anyway, that is apoptosis, and that's also important during the developmental process. Okay? Any questions? Let's go look at some grafting.